Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our talk. It's going to be a very special afternoon with Dianne Johnstone. Dianne joined the Society some 20 years ago. But prior to that, she did the thing that most people did. She went to school, she got married, she had a couple of kids, and then somewhere about 22 years ago, she started researching her family. 20 years ago, she actually joined the Society. And she's been with the Society from that day to this, helped along the way when she's reached some difficult times. And this afternoon, she's going to share those 20 years of discovery with us. It's a very interesting story about how persistence can unravel the mysteries of a family. So let me welcome Dianne Johnstone and wish you all a good afternoon to enjoy the talk.
Thank you, Barbara and Danny, for making this happen this afternoon. And thank you to the Society for giving me an opportunity to share the many discoveries that I've made along the way. Who do I belong to? My story begins with this question. In the realms of family history, each one of us could ask this question, and fingers crossed, we would find an answer. How I came to choose the title of my story. Well, several years ago, this question came up when I stayed in the Outer Hebrides on the islands of Harris and Lewis. I spoke to a weaver there, and in conversation, she told me that when a foreign face appeared from another island or a clan, a question was put to the stranger. Not, where is your family? Who are your parents? What's your family name? The question was, who do you belong to? I came away asking myself the same question, and I knew the answer. It had come 22 years ago, out of the blue, and caused my life to change dramatically, never to be the same again. Over those 22 years, I've written a series of stories documenting my journey. Their contents have now emerged as a book, shared with my families both here and across oceans. Let's start with me. This is the first photo that was ever taken of us three. Mum, Dad and me, aged 11 weeks. It was taken with a box brownie camera up at Ettalong on the central coast of New South Wales. I was to return to this photo time and again, and I was drawn to it for some reason. There's a quaint story about how my name was chosen. My name was drawn out of a hat. Favourite names of the family were written on pieces of paper and put into my grandfather's hat. The name that was drawn out was Dianne. And when I told this story at school, my schoolmates thought that my family was crazy. I just thought they were different. Here are some snapshots. Didn't seem to matter, though, where a photo was taken of me, whether it was by a street photographer in Sydney or in the backyard of my grandparents' home in Newtown. I was always wearing that big hair ribbon. Couldn't go anywhere without it. I was born in 1944, an only child, and I was raised in Redfern. It was a different world back then. The postman came twice a day, and the iceman, the coal man, the milker and the baker all made deliveries to the local community. Trams were running, not always on time, and every shop in Sydney promptly shut at midday on Saturdays. My years in Redfern. Mum and Dad rented a terrace in Marriott Street, Redfern. A narrow lane ran along the back of the terraces, and all the children played there. We played jacks and marbles, and we rode our bikes and scooters up and down the lane. Mum made our home very comfortable, and I was happy there. Dad worked for a family printing firm run by Wally J. Cryer. Dad's boss let me have any waste paper from the greeting cards produced on the machines because I love to draw, and this was a luxury. I attended school in Cleveland Street and later on Crown Street High. During those years, schoolmates would ask me if I were English, Jewish, or Italian. I thought this a bit strange. So I asked Mum and Dad, what about it? Why these questions? And they answered, our family has been in Australia for 5 generations. And that was that. But why was I asked those questions? I wanted to know more about our family, but answers were vague or not answered at all. I guessed that they may not have been interested. But when neither Mum nor Dad could tell me what time I'd been born, I sensed an uneasiness, which I couldn't verbalise at the time. I decided not to pursue this matter as I could see that my questions worried them. But I felt there was something they weren't telling me. Was it a secret about me? Mum had been very unhappy living in Redfern. She didn't speak to the community for 12 years. Why was that? I wondered. She seemed fearful and suffered bouts of depression and anxiety, which I couldn't understand. And strangely, she always got me to answer the door when there was a knock on that front door. We eventually moved from Redfern when I was 14 and settled into our own home in Punchbowl, an outer suburb of Sydney, which pleased Mum no end. She was very, very happy to have left Redfern. Well, life takes over and life events and challenges came along. I took up a teaching career over the next 35 years and was married and had 2 sons. And we had a lot of happy occasions. In this photo, it's a celebration of 3 birthdays. The birthday of my partner, Mark, my eldest son, Robert, and my grandson, Man. And this is my youngest son, Murray, with his wife, my daughter-in-law. And here's the birthday cake. And there was a bit of a tough tussle to see how many people, how far it would spread between three birthdays. There were happy times. My parents and I had some really good times together. And here we are at Ettalong, canoeing out on the water. And later on, when I was 21, when I had my 21st birthday with Mum and Dad. But the unease that I'd felt with them still lingered, and sadly, we became estranged for several years. I felt that I had not met the expectations that they'd set for me. My expectations had been different. I started to wonder if I'd been adopted. I pushed the idea out of my head as Mum and Dad had given me a safe and loving upbringing, a fine education and a code of ethics which I've carried with me right through my life. But the pieces didn't quite fit. My parents and I grew closer again over time as my boys grew older. Mum passed away in 1986, and 12 years later, Dad became very ill with dementia. At the same time, I was diagnosed with breast cancer and had an operation 5 weeks before Dad passed away. I was at his bedside at the last, but he said nothing, just squeezed my hand. My doctor couldn't guarantee that the cancer wouldn't come back, so I decided to tie up those loose ends and put those old doubts that had been at the back of my mind to rest once and for all. Mum and Dad had passed away, so whatever I might find wouldn't hurt them. Had I been adopted? It was now 1998. 8 years earlier, the Adoption Information Act had been passed, enabling birth parents and children to make contact if they so wished. Prior to this information, relating to one's adoption, it was sealed away in files, never to be released. I made an appointment with the Department of Community Services, taking the extract of my birth with me. A letter came a week later with the answer that changed my life. Yes, I had been adopted. In one fell swoop, my doubts were put to rest, but it was still a shock to find this out at 55. Even more of a shock to find that my cousins, aunts and uncles also knew the secret, but had never breathed a word. And on this original birth certificate is my original name, Denise Joy, and my mother, Pearl Pearson Black. And here's the second birth certificate, the one I'd carried with me right from the beginning, showing my second name, the one that was drawn out of my grandfather's hat, Dianne Eileen, and the names of my adoptive parents, Valerie and Leslie Johnstone. But I noted that there were no details of their birthplace, their date or place of marriage, or their age. Nothing. The New South Wales adoption law of 1990 impacted thousands of lives. The Act was intended to correct the problem of genealogical bewilderment. And I quote, "Many people would argue that without knowledge of your origins, you cannot truly know who you are. I wake up every day now and I know who I am." 19 days ago, I received yet a third birth certificate, an integrated birth certificate. And it includes both my birth mother, Pearl, and adoptive parents, Valerie and Leslie, and my two names, Denise and Dianne. The language has changed too. Birth mother is now mother at birth, and adoptive parents are now parents after adoption. And here is my integrated birth certificate. This column, the middle one, represents the person's legal name and legal parents. And over here on the right-hand side is the column containing my birth mother's name and my own original name, Denise Joy and Pearl Pearson Black. If ever and whenever I'm asked to produce a birth certificate for any reason, I know which one I'm going to produce, and it's going to be this integrated birth certificate. No more secrets. The secret is out, and I know that my late mother, Pearl, would have been thrilled to see her name together with Val and Les, all together, and both names, the name she gave me, Denise Joy. Here's my first meeting with Tony Mum. She was still alive, and we met shortly after my discovery, and it was such a happy reunion. And when I looked at my mother, I saw a reflection of myself. I met my sister, here she is here, and Mum and me, and we're on a Captain Cook cruise on the Sydney Harbour to celebrate my sister's 50th birthday a while ago. I met my sister and cousins here in Sydney and was elated to find that I had family in England too. So my research actually led to English first cousins in neighbouring counties meeting for the first time. Previously, they'd never known about each other's existence. Here is Anita. She lives in Leeds. And here is the first cousin she didn't know existed, Jeffrey, and he lives in Manchester. And here is Norman from Essex. So it's been a very happy reunion, both here and in England. I wondered what Mum and Dad would have thought of all this. One cousin described their reaction as being absolutely devastated. They had kept their secret of my adoption all their lives, and I believe that Mum especially had paid a huge price. I thought a lot about my two mothers, Valerie and Tony. They were the subjects of my next story, and I wondered if they had known one another. A few stories that I'd heard suggested that this may have been the case. I found out that they'd gone to the same school in Newtown, a few years apart, but still in the same locality. On researching the adoption laws before the groundbreaking Act of 1990, I found that it was not uncommon for birth and adoptive parents to have known one another at the time of adoption. This could have explained the reclusive life Mum led, the anxiety, the nervousness, the depression and fear she experienced while we lived in Redfern, perhaps dreading that Pearl would come looking for me. Pearl later told me that she wanted to see me, but had hesitated, as she thought that Mum and Dad would not have told me that I'd been adopted. She was right. Many life-changing discoveries were to follow, too many to describe in this presentation. Instead, I shall just recount the events from my book that stand out for me over the past 22 years of family research. The first of these was the discovery of my great-grandfather's will. And here is Bernard, my great-grandfather, Bernard Schwartz, and his young bride, Hannah Fager Goldstein, also known as Annie. This was taken on their wedding day in 1898. I learnt of his will at the Society of Australian Genealogists down in Sydney. This was a breakthrough for the family both here and in England, because we discovered that Bernard had brothers and a sister in America. They had all been born in Egypt and were Austrian Jews according to the British and American census. Bernard was the only one who had settled in England. Of course, we got in touch with our American branch of the family, and without exception, the families were happy to find each other and made contact across the oceans. So we have the Californian family, and right over in Florida, we've got cousins there as well. And we're still in very close contact with each other. It is at this point I'd like to give a brief outline of my two families, birth family and adoptive family. Here's my adoptive family's family tree. And here am I at the top with my adoptive name, Dianne. Mum's family, Valerie Ferguson, all down here, Belpett and Ferguson, English names with some Irish thrown in as well. My great-grandmother, Mary Costello. On my father's side, Caroline Lewis and Reuben were my grandparents, and a generation further back was Richard and Mary Jane Cole. They had 14 children. They had a lot of large families in those days. And over here, Elizabeth Cook, her father was a convict, Emmanuel Cook, and he'd come out at 18 years of age and made good. So after 10 years, he got his own farm, and he went on to have 14 children too. Right, here is my other family tree. And here is my original name, Denise Joy Black. On Mum's side of the family, there's a little mix here. There are English, my grandmother born in England, along with the 14 children of Bernard and Hannah. Bernard came from Egypt, but was Austrian Jewish, and his bride, Hannah Goldstein, was Russian, and her family were Jewish, settled first in Poland, but with the different partitions of Poland, the towns have changed and they've gone into Lithuania. Anyway, that's another story. On this side, my birth father, Jack Dupree, sounds French and actually is, because Jean-Joseph Dupuis, his grandfather, my great-grandfather, came from Alsace-Lorraine in France. There's Irish descent, and there's also a lot of English descent, with some of the people actually fighting in the American Civil War. In 2005, I travelled to Hull in Yorkshire, England. My ancestors settled in this city after their escape from Poland back in the 1870s. 3 generations of my birth family are buried here in the Jewish cemeteries. My visit to see their resting place was a moving experience. It was Sunday, and it was to be one of the momentous days in my life. I had arranged to meet Dr. David Lewis from the Hull Jewish Archives that morning. He was to take me to the cemeteries where my ancestors were buried. At 10 o'clock, we set off and drove down a narrow lane on the outskirts of the main town, stopping outside 2 iron gates. I got out, walked across and waited. David locked the car and came over with what looked like a map and a cluster of keys in his hands. He unlocked the gates and pushed them open. Lifting a rock near the stone wall, he placed the keys under it, stood up and opened the map. Now, just give me a moment. I've got to find out exactly where it is, he said. Mind the ground, it's soft and muddy with the rain. I looked around at the small burial ground. Rows of graves were neatly laid out. They fitted tightly together, allowing no foot space between them. I held my camera in readiness as David led me across the rows. David was right. The earth was muddy and soft, and I had trouble keeping my balance, while at the same time trying not to step on the graves. You can't help walking over them, said David. They're so close together. We stopped in front of a headstone. The name Bernard Black had been etched with care onto the surface. I had seen the name on marriage, death certificates, British census, and just days before, I'd seen his wedding photo taken over 100 years ago. I lifted the camera to my eye, waiting for that elusive sunlight to illuminate the stone. At that moment, I played the role of genealogist, engrossed in the task of information gathering. The remaining members of Bernard's family were waiting on the other side of the world, waiting to hear what I'd found. I felt a responsibility, a need to deliver, but most of all, a need not to disappoint. The sun came out at last and I took the photo. The role of genealogist was done and I felt relief. I stepped closer to take another shot, and as I did, my foot slipped. With my free hand, I reached out, gripping the headstone for support. I caught my breath, for at that moment I realised that touching the stone would be the closest that I would ever come to touching the man. And I whispered the words, great-grandfather. I saw the Hebrew inscriptions on the headstones, and I asked David if he could send me the translations by the time I'd returned back to Sydney. This he did, and I was excited to find that the name of my great-great-great-grandfather was Dupuis. He'd always gone by the name of Barnet or Lazer or Lazarus while he was in England, never used the name Dupuis. I had his name now, but not his former home in Europe. That was to come later. Now, in the process of my research, I came up against several brick walls, one of which was trying to trace my great-great-grandmother in the 1891 census. She'd been living with her father, and here she is in the centre gravestone, headstone. Her name is Annie Goldstein, and she had the same name as her daughter, the bride of Barnet. In 1881, I'd found that she was living with her father, Barnet Lazer, and a child. But then I noted in the 1891 census that there were records of institutions mentioned in the census. So on a hunch, I thought I'll just look up some of these institutions. It may be she's in hospital. And there she was. I found her, an inmate in the De La Pole Asylum, just outside of Hull. Jewish Archives could not help me with hospital records, so I tried the Latter-day Saints in Hull. they found the hospital case notes. Here is Chas Ellerington, the gentleman who went through files and files to find those hospital case notes, and he was very successful. And it was a great find for all our families. A sad one, but a most important one. A sad story followed from those notes. Her father states that Annie's illness, in its recent form, is only of 3 days' duration. She had been observed as being depressed and peculiar for about a week. The last 2 years have been difficult for her, with lots of trouble at home. Her husband left her after she was 2 months pregnant. She traced him to Manchester, where he had assumed a new name and remarried. She had no financial support from him whatsoever, but supported herself and child by doing housekeeping work, her child at this time, 1882, being 4 years old. Hinda was to spend the last 18 years of her life in the De La Pole institution. Family research, I found, uncovered human tragedy as well as happy reunions. Just when I thought I could go no further in my family research, a discovery was once again made by David Lewis. He had found 2 letters written in 1878 and 1882 by my 3rd great-grandfather, Dov Eliezer Dukowski. They were written in Hebrew and Yiddish, and I remembered that according to the British census, Barnet Lazer, or Eliezer Dukowski, he was a Hebrew teacher. The 2 letters confirmed the sad outcome of Hinda Goldstein, his daughter, and described the hardship he and his granddaughter had suffered in the first 5 years of their new life in Hull. He'd signed the letters Barnet Lazer, but I now knew his original name from his headstone, Dukowski. In these letters, he revealed the town from where the family had come, Kalvarija, which is now in southwest Lithuania, which had been in the Pale of Settlement. So over here on the left is the Pale of Settlement, running from the Black Sea north to the Baltic. Over here on the right-hand side is a map of southwest Lithuania. Here is Kaunas at the top, if I can just click on there. Kaunas, to the northeast, you would find Vilna, or Vilnius, the capital. And coming down, you would come to Mariampol, and finally to Kalvarija, which is now in southwest Lithuania. Before the last partition of Poland, Kalvarija was over here in the Suwałki Gubernia, and here are the letters. I simply had to hold those letters, which had probably not been read for the past 140 years. David Lewis and I went to the London Metropolitan Archives, where the letters were kept, and they're still there for any other member of the family, wherever they may be, can come and view them. A grey folder tied with a blue ribbon was brought out. We opened it and found those letters. I was amazed to find that Barnet had written on much smaller pieces of paper than I'd imagined, given the detailed information in his correspondence. I picked them up and found the paper was thick and rough. In spite of this, it was clear to see that the Hebrew script was written in a very fine hand. And here I was 4 generations later, holding these 2 letters, letters written by a troubled father and grandfather, pleading for help in a strange country with a different language, different laws, and a different religion. Just reading the translations, it is still raw. The next big turning point was finding Kalvarija. And here I am back to my roots at last. I joined a group of travellers who, like me, were returning to the homes of their ancestors. It was as if I'd stepped back 70 years in time. The Jewish community had then numbered about 8,000 in the town. Now there were no Jewish citizens left. Words cannot describe the emotions I felt walking down Sodhu Street, past old wooden houses to the synagogues where my family worshipped 140 years ago. Many of these homes are surrounded by little gardens full of flowers, vegetables, and quite a few fruit trees. They all have power connected to them now, but every now and again you see a well in the middle of the street where people can still access some water. And here is the Beit Midrash, the rabbi's house. It was used as a granary in World War II. And if they hadn't have found a use for it, I'm sure authorities would have pulled it down. The synagogue complex was once consisted of two synagogues, which was quite unusual. A winter synagogue and a summer one. And the rabbi's house, which you can just see at the back of the winter synagogue, you can see the roof and a little bit of the dark red brick. That was all part of the complex. The winter synagogue has since been renovated with plans for a music school to be established there. Note the tablets above the main entrance, the only evidence that it was once a synagogue. When I was there in 2013, the music school had not eventuated, but I've since learned that there are plans to preserve the complex with the intention of bringing tourists and visitors back to the town. I returned to Australia bringing many stories of my Lithuanian journey back to the family, and ironically, a chain of events which began in Lithuania was to lead me to my final story, the discovery of my birth father. During my trip to Lithuania, many stories were shared amongst our group of travellers. One of them, this lovely lady on the left with me, was one of them heard my story, and she said, "Oh, I've just recently discovered a cousin through DNA in Melbourne." So the cousin and I apparently had a lot in common. And on the right-hand side, here am I with that cousin in Melbourne. We'd both been adopted. Our fathers were American, and we had discovered that we had Jewish families. Pearl, my mother, had told me that my father was French-American and was called Jack Dupree. On my return to Sydney, I contacted the cousin in Melbourne. We exchanged our stories, and about 18 months later, she gave me the name of a researcher who offered to trace my father. Success. With DNA confirmation, Jack Dupree was indeed my birth father. But there was, however, a tragic twist in this discovery. Sadly, I found out that he'd lost his life in the Philippines in the very last days of World War II. He was only 24. He was a corporal in the 1st Division Cavalry. In 2017, my partner Mark and I travelled over to Texas for a Dupree reunion. Over 100 people came and welcomed us. You were Jack's legacy, I was told. And around about the middle, you can see where I am, very short, and so is Jack's remaining surviving sister. We're both shorties. You were Jack's legacy, I was told. Now, I learned a lot about Jack, my father. I learned that he'd been a rodeo rider and a horse whisperer. He joined the US Cavalry in 1940 and trained the horses in the 5th Regiment. Now, there's a funny little story about this horse. There's Jack, my father, riding this horse, and he was called 5 minutes to midnight. Now, there was another horse called Midnight, and he is buried in Oklahoma. And no one could ride Midnight, not able to ride him for the required 8 seconds on his back. Now, along came another horse, nearly as good, maybe not quite as good. So he was called 5 minutes to midnight. And here is Jack riding him for the required 8 seconds. And 5 minutes to midnight is buried alongside Midnight, both in Oklahoma. They treasure their horses. And here he is training the horses in the 5th Regiment. He just loved his horses and they would do anything for him. His sister, late sister Dorothy, wrote warmly of him, describing Jack as a kind and loving brother. And he could make the horses account by pawing. He could make them dance. And yes, there was a French connection, as I've just shown in the birth family, the great-grandparents. Jack's grandfather, my great-grandfather, had come from France when he was 17 years old, and he settled in Texas. The photo on the right shows me at the base of my father's grave. His remains were brought back from the Philippines and are buried along with his father, his parents and grandparents. So another 3 generations, all buried in Toole, the little town of Toole in Texas. Jack's sister, Norma Sue, still going very well. She's 4 years older than I am. She is with me, and I am holding a picture of young Jack when he was very young. And just behind us is my first cousin, Rhonda, Norma Sue's daughter. Here is the family photo of Jean-Joseph Dupuis with Tranquilla, the daughter of his first marriage, and his second wife, Josephine, and their son, Eugene, my grandfather. The other photo is one of Jacob and Ryan, 2 scouts who presented me with the American flag. Now, when they first came to me with the flag, it was unfurled, it was enormous, very, very big. And it was obviously a very solemn ceremony, which I had not seen before. But the boys then proceeded to fold it, fold upon fold, ever so carefully and with reverence. And when they presented that flag to me in the photo, I really felt so much a part of my French and American heritage. So finding Jack is the last of my stories. I began with the question, who do I belong to? My answer is, I belong to 3 families: my adoptive family, my birth family of my mother, and my father's family. Writing has helped in the healing process of coming to grips with Denise Joy and Dianne Eileen, 2 identities from 2 different backgrounds. Writing has brought new perspectives on my experience over the years, helping me to understand, never to judge, and to evolve. So it's okay to begin a book setting out on one's course, only to find that the book and its content have changed direction while you weren't looking. But don't let this deter you. Those of you who contemplate writing a book about your fabulous family history, my advice is don't hesitate. Thank you.
Dianne, congratulations. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
And I want to know now if there are any questions from anybody that has watched this presentation that has some unanswered questions.
It was very, very interesting. Glad I came.
Good. We're glad you enjoyed it.
Thank you.
So very interesting is a comment that comes from the floor where we are. Are there any further comments from here or online, in the chat?
The question is, where does one get an integrated birth certificate?
Okay, the question was, where do you get an integrated birth certificate? Does that have your handout?
Yes, please.
Okay, yeah. So it's on the handout that I'm about to give you.
Thank you.
Those who are online, I'm happy to send it.
Yes, it's the Births, Deaths and Marriages Office, and they send you out a form first, and you fill out everything you know about your family, your adoptive family, and then they will go through the files and find the information to produce an integrated birth certificate for you.
Thank you.
I have a question. Where did you test DNA? With which company?
With the family tree, the one in America, the American family tree, their DNA.
And your name there is Dianne, is it Johnston? Or...
Yes, it is.
Okay. I will check if we are related.
Did the Dupree family know of your existence when you were born? And do you have information about how the adoption occurred here in Australia?
Yes, I can answer both those questions. They'd had no knowledge of me, so my father didn't know. As far as I can tell, Dad didn't know that he had a daughter. The other question, what was it again? How did the adoption take place? It was at a government agency, and it was through I was born at Bethesda, which is a Salvation Army home for unmarried mothers. Now it's changed, and I think it's still a home for young people, I think. It's still there, and I've taken photos of it. And
where was it? In Gutley, was it? Where was the Salvation Army?
yes, it was in Marrickville.
Oh, no.
All those stories I put together into a book. There we are. It's got belonging and my name, Dianne Johnstone.
And there is a copy in the AJGS library.
Yes.
For anybody who would like to come and read the rest of the story, the details that we couldn't cover in today's talk.
Otherwise, we'd have been here till the middle of next week.
You've done an amazing job. And so we'd like you to go home and celebrate with a small gift.
Thank you.
Enjoy.
Thank you so much.